This is no place for a farm girl to play with high-level mathematics. Carter. The voice of Professor Leonard Harrow cracked through the quiet like a whip. The chalk in his hand struck the tray beneath the blackboard with a dry tap, releasing a thin cloud of white dust into the air. Heads turned. The new girl at the door, with her plain cotton dress and worn brown boots, stood very still. She held the strap of her bag in both hands, her deep brown eyes fixed ahead. She looked as if she had walked straight out of a wheat field and into another world. The air in the room tightened. Someone stifled a laugh. Hannah Carter took a slow breath, crossed the room, and settled in the empty desk at the back. Harrow's eyes followed her, cool and unblinking, like ice on a winter pond. That morning, Kansas had wrapped itself in a thin scarf of mist. The cornfields stretched endlessly, their leaves whispering in the early wind. Hannah sat on the wooden porch steps of the farmhouse, holding the small cloth bag her mother had packed. Inside were a few sets of clothes, a thick notebook, and a pouch of golden corn seeds. Her father, James Carter, stood in the yard, his boots planted in the damp earth, the bag of seed resting against his leg. He looked out over the wide fields as if he could press their every furrow and fence post into memory. Her mother, Amelia Carter, came to her side and laid a worn wool sweater across her shoulders. Into her hands, she pressed the pouch of corn seeds. "These came from your grandfather," she said softly. "He chose them when he was your age. When you miss home, hold them. The earth will find its way back to you in your memory." Hannah nodded, the pouch warm in her palms. The bus ride away from the small Kansas town took them past weathered wooden fences and a bridge over a dry creek bed, then onto the long black ribbon of the interstate. Low buildings fell away behind them. Hours later, the skyline began to rise, glass and steel catching the sun. St. Alden Academy stood in the oldest quarter of the city. Black iron gates framed a driveway lined with maple trees trimmed into perfect symmetry. The school itself looked like a gray stone castle, a bell tower piercing the sky, stained glass windows catching the morning light in shards of red and gold. Hannah stepped into the courtyard, instantly aware of the difference. Students in spotless white shirts and navy blazers moved in clusters. Their polished black shoes clicked smartly on the stone paths. Conversations filled the air, but when their eyes dropped to her scuffed boots, the sound dimmed. By the gate, a group of boys whispered, "They say she got in on some rural scholarship. Probably only knows how to ride a horse and shuck corn." Hannah heard every word, but she did not turn. Her mother's voice was steady in her memory. "Some words are pebbles. If you do not bend to pick them up, they will never weigh you down." The advanced mathematics classroom was on the second floor of the main building. The heavy wooden door opened onto a room scented faintly of chalk and new paper. Rows of desks stood in perfect order, each with a small drawer beneath. On the blackboard, Professor Harrow was writing a long equation in his precise hand. He turned when she entered. "You are the new student." "Yes, sir." "Back row seat." His voice was quiet but cool. Hannah sat, opened her notebook, and looked at the board. The equation was written in a way that concealed its nature, as though meant to test whether the class was paying attention. The lesson passed slowly. Pens scratched. Now and then, students leaned toward one another, murmuring questions. Hannah kept her eyes on the board, her notes neat and steady. When the bell rang, the class poured into the hallway like water from a broken jar. A boy passing her desk spoke under his breath to a friend. "She will not last a month here." Hannah lifted her bag and walked out. Through a tall window, she saw the school's green lawn, so unlike the gold and brown of the cornfields. In the pocket of her coat, the pouch of corn seeds rested against her palm, a small, steady heartbeat from home. That evening, in their small apartment on the city's edge, the family gathered for dinner. 2 bedrooms, one kitchen that served also as a living room, but the table felt warm. Her father asked, "How was school today?" "Different." "How different?" "Everything here is straight and polished. I feel like a wild weed in a garden of roses." Her mother smiled. Weeds reach for the sun just as much as roses do. That night, Hannah opened her notebook and rewrote the equation from Harrow's board. She remembered the nights in Kansas when her mother had drawn equations in the dirt with a stick, explaining them as she would explain water flowing through irrigation channels toward a thirsty field. A complicated equation, her mother said, was much like a dry plot of land. You brought water to it a little at a time, from different paths, until the ground softened and the whole field could grow. Outside, the hum of traffic mingled with the distant wail of a train. Hannah knew she was far from home, but the resolve within her had already taken root. She would show them that intellect was not born from where you stood, but from what you reached for. The next morning, she wore the same blue dress and brown boots. She walked into the classroom more slowly, letting her gaze rest on each face before taking her seat. The empty chair at the back seemed to wait for her. She set her bag down, opened her notebook, and picked up her pencil. In the hallway, the measured footsteps of Professor Harrow drew closer. Hannah took a deep breath. In her mind, the Kansas fields spread wide beneath a sky as endless as the days ahead. The classroom was quiet enough that Hannah could hear the faint tick of the wall clock as the students settled in. Professor Leonard Harrow stood at the front, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a fresh stick of chalk. His eyes moved slowly across the room, pausing here and there as if measuring the worth of each face before him. Without a word, he turned to the blackboard and began to write. The chalk moved in sure, deliberate strokes, building a line of symbols that stretched nearly the entire width of the board. When he finished, the equation stood there like a wall, high, unbroken, and intimidating. Hannah knew the shape of it almost immediately. It was a second-order differential equation with an unusual boundary condition and a forcing term that twisted the whole thing into unfamiliar territory. Most equations of this type could be solved with a known sequence of steps, but the coefficients in this one seemed designed to resist neat solutions. Harrow stepped back and dusted his hands lightly, turning to face the class. 20 minutes, he said, his voice smooth but sharp at the edges. Anyone who can solve it will earn the equivalent of my salary for the year, $100,000. There was a ripple of laughter, half amused, half incredulous. It is, of course, impossible, Harrow went on. But perhaps one of you wishes to attempt the impossible. His gaze slid deliberately toward the back of the room, where Hannah sat with her pencil poised. She felt the weight of that glance settle on her like the winter wind back in Kansas, the kind that searched for every gap in your coat. Around her, students exchanged quick looks. Some smirked. A boy in the row ahead whispered, "Not our problem." Another, further forward, muttered, "It is a waste of time." Hannah looked again at the board. Her mind began tracing paths through it, testing ideas like a farmer walking the edge of a flooded field, looking for a place to step in. She thought of her mother's voice on those summer nights, explaining how to tame a problem too large to face all at once. "Begin with what you know," her mother had said. "Every big field starts with the first furrow." She set her pencil down and slowly rose to her feet. The low chatter in the room faltered. Hannah stepped into the aisle, walked to the front, and stood beside Harrow. Without asking, she reached for the chalk. A few students gasped softly. One or two leaned forward in their seats, suddenly curious. Hannah began with the outer shell of the equation, writing the first step, as if peeling away the husk from an ear of corn. She spoke just loudly enough for the nearest rows to hear. "We start by separating the variables so that each part of the equation holds to itself. This makes it easier to see the path forward." She rewrote the problem in a way that brought its hidden structure into the open. The form was still complicated, but no longer shapeless. From there, she moved to integration by parts, a method her mother had taught her not at a desk, but in the yard behind the farmhouse, using a garden hose to demonstrate how the flow of water could be split and rejoined. It is like letting one part of the problem do the work for another, she explained softly as she worked. The scratch of chalk was steady and unhurried. Harrow stood motionless, arms crossed, his eyes on the board. One by one, students rose from their seats, drawn forward by the quiet certainty in Hannah's movements. The boy who had muttered earlier now leaned over the desk in front of him, trying to follow each transformation she made to the equation. When she reached the substitution step, she paused just long enough to explain it in plain terms. "We replace a tangled piece with something simpler, something we already understand," she said, "like setting aside a twisted stalk and planting a straight one in its place." The lines on the board began to shift into a form that was more familiar, more tractable. The impossible wall was starting to show a door. In the corner of her eye, Hannah could see Harrow's jaw tighten. His hands, clasped loosely behind his back, gripped a little harder. She pressed on, each step more certain than the last. When the equation at last resolved into a linear system, she heard a faint murmur run through the room. This was the moment when theory met clarity, when what had seemed like a wild stretch of weeds revealed the rows of an orderly field. Hannah moved through the final simplifications, each one building on the last, until the solution stood complete. She placed the chalk carefully on the tray and stepped back. There. It was not a challenge, not a boast, only the simple statement of a fact, as her father might say when the last bale of hay was stacked in the loft. The room was still. She turned to Harrow. "You gave your word," she said, her tone even. $100,000 in front of the class. No one moved. A clock ticked. The boy in the front row blinked rapidly, as if trying to decide whether to laugh or applaud. Harrow's mouth tightened to a thin line. His gaze flicked to the door where the headmaster had appeared, drawn by the hush in the room. The headmaster's eyes went from the filled blackboard to Hannah, and then to Harrow. "Professor Harrow," the headmaster said, "I believe you made a promise." Harrow's lips parted, but no words came immediately. At last he inclined his head slightly. "I did," he said. The bell rang, a sudden sharpness in the still air. The students began to gather their books, but their eyes stayed on the front of the room. Hannah walked back to her desk, the pouch of corn seeds in her coat pocket warm against her palm. For her, it was not about the money. It was about the truth of what her mother had always told her, that any field, no matter how barren it looks, will yield if you have the patience to work it. And she had just planted her first row. That evening, in the small apartment, her parents listened as she recounted the day. Her father's eyes twinkled, though he said nothing. Her mother rested her hand lightly on Hannah's, as if passing on some invisible strength. "You remember," Amelia said, "when we rebuilt the south field after the storm. Everyone said it could not be done." Hannah nodded. "It is always impossible until it is finished." Outside, the city lights flickered against the night sky. Hannah sat at the table long after her parents had gone to bed, sketching equations in her notebook. The trap Harrow had set had become a path, and she knew there would be others, harder ones perhaps, more cleverly hidden. But the first had been crossed. And that, she thought, was how every long journey began. The morning after, the hallways of St. Aldan Academy felt subtly different. It was not louder, if anything the chatter among students seemed quieter, but there was a new kind of attention in the air. When Hannah walked through the main doors, she noticed the sideways glances. Some carried curiosity, others something sharper. A few of the older students, who had probably never bothered to learn the name of a scholarship girl from Kansas, now looked at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. She made her way to the second floor. In the corridor outside the advanced mathematics classroom, a pair of boys leaned against the lockers, talking in low voices. As she passed, one of them said just loud enough to carry, "That's her, the farm girl who solved it." Hannah kept walking. She had learned on the farm that attention could be like sudden weather, unpredictable, not always welcome, and best handled by steady movement. Inside the classroom, a few students were already seated. The boy who had muttered in disbelief 2 days earlier now gave her a small nod, hesitant but genuine. She returned it. Professor Harrow was not yet in the room. Hannah opened her notebook, the fresh page ready, and waited. When Harrow entered, his expression was unreadable. He set his leather briefcase on the desk and took out a sheaf of papers without looking at her. His voice was as level as ever when he began the lesson, but Hannah noticed a slight pause before he picked up the chalk. The problem he wrote on the board that day was challenging, but solvable by the class, a far cry from the deliberate trap he had set before. As the lesson moved on, Hannah kept her focus on the work, not the eyes she could feel on her from behind and to the side. At lunch, she carried her tray to a corner table by the window. The dining hall's tall glass panes let in a wash of pale winter light. She had barely sat down when a girl with neatly braided hair approached. "I'm Lydia," the girl said, setting her tray down opposite Hannah. "I saw what you did yesterday. I've never seen Harrow that still before." Hannah smiled faintly. "I just worked the problem." Lydia leaned in a little. "No, you made the rest of us remember that problems are worth working, even when someone tells you they aren't." They talked through lunch, their conversation weaving between schoolwork and small details of life outside these walls. Lydia had grown up in the city and had never seen a wheat field in person. Hannah described the way the air smelled after a summer rain in Kansas, the sound of wind through dry corn stalks, the heavy quiet of snow falling on the barn roof. By the time the bell rang for afternoon classes, there was an unspoken understanding between them, the beginning of a friendship. That evening, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her homework spread out. The lamp cast a warm circle of light over her books. Her father came in from the small balcony where he had been reading the newspaper. "Word's getting around," he said, sitting down across from her. "About the equation?" Hannah asked. "About you," he replied. "Your mother got a call from the headmaster today. Said they want to discuss your performance." Hannah's pencil paused over the page. Was it a good call or a bad call? He smiled slightly. Sounded to me like they're trying to decide which it is. Her mother came in from the kitchen with a pot of tea. "Sometimes," she said, "people are unsettled when they see something they didn't expect. Give them time." The next day, the shift in the atmosphere was more visible. Students who had never spoken to Hannah before now greeted her in the halls. Others watched her with narrowed eyes, as if her presence disrupted an order they had grown used to. In the library, she found Lydia and another girl, Claire, bent over a physics assignment. Claire looked up as Hannah approached. "We were just saying we could use your brain on this one," she said. Hannah slid into the seat beside them. "What's the problem?" Claire pointed to the diagram. It was a mechanics question about a beam under uneven load. Hannah studied it for a moment, then began explaining how to approach it step by step. She used the same tone she would have used explaining how to reinforce a fence post so it would bear the weight of a heavy gate, practical, clear, and grounded in what could be seen and felt. By the end of the period, both girls were grinning. "That makes so much sense now," Claire said. Word spread faster after that, but attention, Hannah discovered, was double-edged. On Thursday morning, as she was leaving her locker, 2 boys she did not know well stepped into her path. "You think you're better than the rest of us because of that one problem," one of them said. "No," Hannah replied evenly. I think anyone could have solved it if they had wanted to try. The boy's mouth twisted. Then why didn't we? Hannah did not answer. She stepped around them and kept walking. Behind her, she heard one of them mutter something she chose not to catch. By Friday, the equation incident had taken on a life of its own. Someone had uploaded a recording of her at the board to a student forum. The video showed her calm focus, the steady rhythm of her writing, the way she explained each step without looking over her shoulder for approval. Comments appeared beneath it, some admiring, some skeptical, a few dismissive. Hannah did not read them. She had learned from the farm that not every voice in the wind was worth listening to. That weekend, she and her parents took the bus to a farmer's market on the edge of the city. For a few hours, the air smelled of fresh bread and apples, and Hannah could almost imagine she was back in Kansas. They bought a small sack of flour and a bundle of herbs. On the way home, her mother said, "You know, when your father and I were working in Boston, we met people who thought intelligence had an address, a salary, and a title. They were wrong then, and Harrow is wrong now." Hannah looked out the window at the blur of the city streets. "I don't want to prove him wrong for me. I want to prove him wrong for everyone who's been told they can't." Her father reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "That's the right reason." Monday morning came cold and bright. In the first class of the day, Harrow handed out a new set of problems. His voice carried no hint of challenge as he told them to work in pairs. Hannah found herself next to Lydia. They bent over the page together. Hannah noticed that Lydia's handwriting was small and precise, the letters lined up as if marching in step. Halfway through, Lydia said, "You know he's going to test you again." Hannah nodded. "That's all right." Lydia gave her a long look. "You don't even seem nervous." Hannah smiled faintly. "My mother says nervousness is just excitement without a plan. I like to have a plan." By the end of the week, Hannah had been asked for help in 3 different subjects. She never refused, but she also never gave the answers outright. Instead, she showed how to find them, the same way her parents had taught her, making the path clear, but letting others walk it themselves. Some students began to follow her example, helping one another in ways that had been rare before. It was a small shift, almost invisible if you were not looking for it, but it was there. And somewhere in the background, Professor Harrow was watching. Late Friday afternoon, as Hannah was leaving the building, she passed the open door of Harrow's classroom. He was at his desk, reading a file. Without looking up, he said, "Carter, a word." She stepped inside. "That problem you solved," Harrow said, still not meeting her eyes. "Where did you learn that method?" Hannah thought of her mother drawing lines in the dirt, of her father's voice explaining how to measure a beam by the shadow it cast. "I learned it at home," she said. Harrow's head lifted slightly at that, but he said nothing more. He only nodded once and returned to his papers. Hannah left the room without hurry. In her coat pocket, the pouch of corn seeds was as steady as ever. She knew this was not over, but she also knew she would not hesitate when the next test came. Monday morning carried the pale light of early winter, the kind that seemed to soften the edges of the stone buildings of St. Alden Academy. The air inside the advanced mathematics classroom was still, as if waiting. Hannah took her usual seat at the back, her notebook open, pencil resting across the page. Lydia sat one row ahead, giving her a small smile before turning to face the front. Professor Leonard Harrow entered without a word. He placed his worn leather briefcase on the desk, unlatched it, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. For a long moment, he stood looking at it, as though weighing something in his mind. Then, without preamble, he turned to the board and began to write. The chalk moved quickly, building an expression that sprawled across the blackboard in loops and angles. The form was not unlike the earlier impossible equation, but there were subtle differences. A shift in the boundary conditions, a change in the forcing term, a coefficient that would look harmless to the untrained eye, but would complicate the solution in unexpected ways. When he finished, he stepped back. The board now held a problem that seemed to breathe challenge. This one, he said, can be done. The question is, who here has the discipline to see it through? No mention of a prize this time. No overt glance toward Hannah. But the silence in the room seemed to lean in her direction. For a while, the only sounds were pencils moving and pages turning. Some students frowned. Others tapped their erasers against the desk. A few had already stopped writing, their eyes drifting toward the window. Hannah studied the board. The first steps were clear to her. Isolate the most complicated term, simplify where possible, and avoid being drawn into side paths that led nowhere. She began to work in her notebook, her pencil moving in clean lines. 5 minutes passed. 10. Around her, more students gave up, whispering to one another or staring at the board with unfocused eyes. At the front, Harrow folded his arms. Hannah felt Lydia's gaze turn toward her. In a quiet voice, Lydia asked, "Can you see it?" "I think so," Hannah replied. "Then you should go show them." Hannah hesitated only a moment before standing. The room stilled. She walked to the front, picked up the chalk, and faced the board. She began not at the top of the equation, but in the middle, breaking apart the section that carried the most weight. As she worked, she spoke in the same low, even tone she had used before. "We start here because it will make the rest easier to handle. If you clear the most tangled section first, the rest will follow." Her method was deliberate, each step written cleanly, no hurried scratches, no wasted movement. She used substitution to transform a term into a simpler form, then integrated by parts to break down what remained. In the back, a chair scraped quietly as one of the stronger students, a boy named Martin, stood and moved closer to see. He had a reputation for speed, often finishing problems before others had set their pencils down. Now, he watched each line appear under Hannah's hand with a focus that was almost physical. "You can think of it like replacing a broken beam in a barn," Hannah said as she rewrote one section. "You remove the bad piece, put in one that fits, and the whole structure holds better." More students rose from their seats, drawn by the calm authority in her voice. The air in the room changed, no longer the restless boredom of a class drifting away from a problem, but the quiet hum of attention when something worth learning is unfolding. Harrow stood by the desk, his face unreadable, but Hannah thought she saw a flicker of something. Not approval, but perhaps a recognition that what she was doing could not be ignored. Step by step, the equation shed its complexity. Where it had looked like a dense thicket, it now revealed a path clear enough for others to follow. When the last transformation brought the problem to a clean, solvable form, Hannah paused. "This part is straightforward," she said. "From here, you can apply the method you already know." She set down the chalk and stepped back. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Martin moved to the board, took up the chalk, and completed the solution in just a few swift lines. He turned to Hannah. "That was the hard part," he said. "You did it." The room seemed to breathe again. Lydia smiled at her as she returned to her seat. When the bell rang, the students filed out with more energy than they had come in with. A few were still talking about the problem, tracing the steps in the air with their hands. Hannah packed her notebook slowly. As she stood to leave, Harrow's voice came from behind her. "Carter." She turned. "You explain things as you work," he said. "Not many do." "It is how I learned," Hannah replied. Harrow regarded her for a moment, then nodded once. "That will serve you well." That evening at home, Hannah told her parents about the day. Her father listened without interrupting, his eyes thoughtful. Her mother's mouth curved in a small smile. "You are not just solving problems," Amelia said. "You are showing others how to look at them. That is harder and more valuable." Hannah thought about the faces leaning in toward the board, about Martin finishing the problem with a kind of satisfaction that was not about speed, but about understanding. Maybe, Hannah said slowly, it is like planting. You do not just keep the grain for yourself, you share the seed. Her father nodded. That is how a field grows. The next morning, something small but important had changed. In the corridor before class, Martin approached her with a folded sheet of paper. Another problem, he said. I could not finish it. I thought maybe you could look. Hannah opened it and scanned the work he had already done. You are close, she told him. You just need to shift your starting point. He frowned. I thought you had to begin at the top. Not always, Hannah said. Sometimes the top is a distraction. By the time they reached the classroom, Martin was already scribbling adjustments in the margins. That day, Harrow's lesson moved briskly. He assigned work in pairs again, and Hannah found herself seated with Martin. They moved through the problems in a steady rhythm. He was quick to spot the shape of the solution. She was careful in setting up each step so nothing collapsed later. Halfway through, Harrow stopped by their desk. He looked at their page for a moment, then asked Martin, Is she slowing you down? Martin shook his head. She is making sure I do not miss anything. Harrow's mouth twitched, though it was hard to say whether it was amusement or something else. He moved on. When the bell rang, Martin handed Hannah back the notebook they had been working in. You should keep this, he said. I have learned more in the last 2 days than I have all term. Hannah accepted it quietly. By week's end, Hannah had noticed something. Fewer students were giving up on the harder problems. The room stayed quieter during work time, but not with boredom, with focus. And when someone got stuck, it was not unusual now for another student to lean over and offer a suggestion. It was a small shift, but Hannah knew from the farm that small shifts given time could change the whole season. As she left the building on Friday afternoon, the winter light was already fading. She slipped her hand into her coat pocket, feeling the familiar shape of the corn seed pouch. The chalk had spoken, she thought, and the class had listened. The first snow of the season had fallen in the night, leaving the city wrapped in a clean, pale light. Hannah walked through the gates of St. Alden Academy with her breath rising in small clouds before her. The iron railings and stone steps gleamed with a thin crust of frost. Inside the main building, the halls smelled faintly of wet wool and old books. She made her way to the advanced mathematics classroom, boots whispering against the polished floor. Lydia was already there, seated near the middle, her braids draped over the back of her chair. She looked up and smiled. Today feels different, Lydia said. Hannah glanced at the blackboard, still bare, and nodded. The room filled quickly, coats draped over chairbacks, the sound of pencils tapping and pages turning. At precisely 9 o'clock, Professor Leonard Harrow entered. He carried no briefcase this time, only a single stick of chalk between his fingers. He did not speak at first. He walked straight to the board and began to write. The chalk hissed faintly as it moved, the sound crisp against the morning stillness. What emerged was not just a problem, but a challenge dressed in symbols, a hybrid of 2 advanced forms, one drawn from classical mechanics, the other from a non-linear system often studied only at the graduate level. It was the sort of problem that could trap even the confident if they rushed at it without care. When he was finished, Harrow set the chalk on the tray and turned. His gaze moved slowly across the room. You will work this one quietly, he said. No talking. 20 minutes. The room settled into the scratch of pencils. Hannah studied the problem, tracing its lines the way her father used to trace the edge of a plow blade before sharpening it. She could see where the traps lay, coefficients chosen to cancel too early if handled without foresight, substitutions that looked simple but would tangle the work further down. She began in her notebook, her pencil steady, but she was also aware of the shifting energy around her. A minute passed, then another. Frowns deepened. Chairs creaked. Some students stopped writing altogether. Others erased entire lines with an air of quiet defeat. The room's sounds thinned until only the faint tick of the wall clock remained. Hannah looked up. The silence was different now. Not the routine quiet of a classroom at work, but a hollow stillness, like the pause before a storm. She glanced at Lydia, who was staring at her page as if the numbers might rearrange themselves out of pity. Without thinking further, Hannah closed her notebook and stood. The movement was enough to draw every eye in the room. She walked to the front, each step echoing softly. Harrow did not stop her. He stepped back from the board, his expression unreadable. Hannah picked up the chalk. "We start here," she said in a voice just above a whisper. Her words seemed to carry anyway. She began at a point near the middle of the equation, where the mechanics term intersected with the nonlinear element. She explained as she wrote, her tone calm, her phrasing simple. "You clear the crossing first, so neither part pulls the other down." The chalk's path was deliberate, the lines clean. She paused now and then to glance at the class, making sure they were following. Slowly, students began to lean forward. Lydia's eyes moved from the board to her notebook, her pencil shadowing Hannah's work. Martin, standing now in the aisle, folded his arms and watched intently. The air in the room shifted. The usual rustle of movement and coughs fell away. Even the clock's ticking seemed fainter. Hannah moved to substitution, her voice still steady. "This part looks harmless, but if you change it too soon, it will collapse the whole frame. You wait until the weight is balanced, then you move it." More heads nodded. A boy near the window tapped his eraser once, then stopped, his gaze fixed on the board. Step by step, the problem unfolded. Where there had been a dense thicket of terms, there was now a clear path. The students' silence was no longer the quiet of uncertainty. It was the silence of shared concentration, of something rare taking shape. Hannah did not rush. She wrote each transformation as if planting seeds in a straight row, each one given room to grow. When she reached the final simplification, she stepped aside. "From here," she said, "the method is the one you already know." She placed the chalk on the tray. No one moved. It was in that stillness that the sound came, the faint click of shoes in the hallway. The door opened and the headmaster stepped inside. He paused just past the threshold, his gaze taking in the filled blackboard, the silent class, and Hannah standing with chalk dust on her fingers. His eyes shifted to Harrow. "Everything all right in here?" the headmaster asked. Harrow's mouth tightened. "Yes," he said. "Everything is under control." The headmaster looked back at Hannah, then at the faces of the students. "It is not often I see this room so quiet," he said. Lydia spoke softly from her seat. "She was showing us how to do it." The headmaster's eyes lingered on Hannah for a moment longer, then he nodded and stepped back into the hall. The door closed, and the echo of his footsteps faded. Harrow turned to the class. "That will be all for today," he said. Students began to gather their books, but the energy in the room was different, more focused, more alive. Several lingered, looking once more at the board before leaving. As Hannah returned to her seat, Lydia leaned toward her. That was something. Hannah smiled faintly. "It was just the work." "No," Lydia said. "It was the way you made it possible for the rest of us." That evening, at home, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her tea. Her mother listened quietly as she described the day. "There is a kind of silence that means people are waiting for something," Amelia said when Hannah had finished. "And there is a kind that means they are watching it happen." Hannah thought of the faces turned toward the board, the way the air had seemed to hold its breath. She understood which kind of silence it had been. Her father, sitting by the window, closed his book. "The thing about a silent field," he said, "is that you do not hear the growth. But it is happening all the same." Hannah wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling its warmth seep into her fingers. In the pocket of her coat, the pouch of corn seeds was still there. She thought of them under the snow in Kansas, hidden, waiting, and alive. The winter morning light was sharp enough to draw long shadows across the desks in the advanced mathematics classroom. Hannah sat in her usual seat at the back, pencil laid neatly across her open notebook. The room was quiet except for the low shuffle of feet as students settled in. Professor Leonard Harrow entered with the briskness of someone determined to control the pace from the start. He carried a folded sheet of paper in one hand, a fresh stick of chalk in the other. "Today," he said, "we will attempt something ambitious." He turned to the board, the chalk clicking faintly as it touched the black surface. The symbols began to flow in measured strokes, forming a problem that sprawled from one end of the board to the other. It was dense, layered, and unforgiving. A second-order system entangled with non-linear constraints, laced with coefficients that seemed harmless but would prove treacherous if handled too soon. When he stepped back, he looked across the room. "This one," he said, "will be left for you to finish entirely. 25 minutes. No interruptions, no questions." The room settled into the sound of graphite against paper. Hannah studied the board, eyes tracing the structure the way her father might walk the fence line of a pasture, noting the weak posts and the places where wire had sagged. She saw where the weight of the equation lay, where to begin pulling without making the whole thing collapse. Around her, students worked quickly at first, the scratch of pencils steady. But within 5 minutes the rhythm began to break. Some erased entire lines, muttering under their breath. Others stared at the page, the first rush of confidence drained away. Hannah worked with quiet precision, each line of her notebook a careful step forward. She resisted the temptation to leap ahead. On the farm, her mother had taught her that rushing a row in the field meant missing the stones that could break the blade. 10 minutes passed. The room's energy grew restless. Pencils tapped, chairs shifted. Harrow paced slowly at the front, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving from face to face. Hannah reached the point she had been aiming for, the knot in the problem where the two systems met. She shifted her approach, sliding into substitution, reshaping the tangled terms into something cleaner. At 15 minutes, she looked up. Several students had stopped entirely, their pages half filled. Lydia caught her eye and gave the smallest nod. Hannah closed her notebook and stood. The scrape of her chair against the floor was loud in the stillness. Without waiting for permission, she walked to the front, lifted the chalk, and faced the board. She began not at the top, but at the point where the system was tightest, speaking as she wrote. "We begin here. If you untie the knot first, the rest will loosen on its own." Her handwriting was clear, each letter and number standing like a fence post set firm in the earth. She explained each transformation, why to hold back on one substitution, when to let a term collapse into its simpler form, how to shift the frame so the problem carried its own weight. The room grew still. Students leaned forward, following the path. Lydia's pencil moved in time with Hannah's chalk, shadowing every step. Martin stood in the aisle, watching closely. Harrow stopped pacing. The chalk moved in steady arcs, leaving behind a trail of logic that pulled the problem into shape. The once sprawling equation now narrowed, each term finding its place. At 20 minutes, Hannah reached the final simplification. The solution was now a clear, solvable form. Nothing hidden, nothing left to guess. She turned to face the room. "From here, it is straightforward," she said. Martin stepped forward and finished the last arithmetic steps in a few quick strokes. When he set the chalk down, the answer stood complete. Hannah looked at Harrow. Her voice was even. "You said, in front of the class, that whoever finished it would receive $100,000, the equivalent of your salary for the year." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Some students glanced at one another, others at Harrow. Harrow's face remained still, but a faint line tightened between his brows. "That was another problem," he said quietly. "It was the same structure," Hannah replied. "And you said, in front of witnesses." The headmaster, drawn by the sudden silence, appeared in the doorway. His eyes took in the board, the gathered students, and Harrow standing at the front. "Is there a problem?" the headmaster asked. Lydia spoke without hesitation. "She solved it, sir, the way she did last time, and he promised a reward." The headmaster looked at Harrow. Harrow's jaw moved once before he spoke. "Yes," he said. "I made a promise." The headmaster's gaze shifted to Hannah. "Then it should be honored." No one moved for a moment. Then Harrow inclined his head the barest degree. "Very well," he said. The bell rang, but no one rushed to leave. Hannah returned to her seat, the chalk dust still on her fingers. For her, the money was only a symbol, proof that a promise should be kept, that work well done had its own weight. As the students filed out, Lydia whispered, "That was more than just solving a problem." Hannah smiled faintly. "Maybe. But sometimes the only way to remind someone is to finish what you start." That evening in the small apartment, the air smelled of bread just out of the oven. Her mother listened to the story with a quiet expression. "It is not just about him keeping his word," Amelia said. "It is about showing everyone else that a word is worth something." Her father, leaning against the counter, nodded. "In the field, if you say you will harvest by the first frost, you do it. Otherwise, the frost does the harvesting for you." Hannah wrapped her hands around a mug of tea, feeling the warmth spread through her palms. She thought of the board, the quiet, the way the class had leaned in together. In her coat pocket, the pouch of corn seeds rested against her hand, steady, familiar, and waiting for the next field to be sown. By midweek, the rumor had a life of its own. It moved down the hallways like a wind that knew every turn, that knew how to slip under doors and around corners. The headmaster had called a meeting. Parents would be present. Some said it would be an apology. Some said it would be a reckoning. By noon, even the younger students who had only heard of the equation in passing knew the time and the place. Hannah ate a quiet lunch with Lydia near the big window in the dining hall. Snow had melted from the courtyard, and the grass shone the deep, damp green of late winter. Lydia kept glancing at the clock. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," Hannah said. She turned the pouch of corn seeds in her pocket with her fingers. It felt like holding a small, steady heart. "I am fine." "If they make it ugly," Lydia said, "we will stand beside you." "It will not be ugly," Hannah said. She believed it. Her mother had taught her that truth does not need to raise its voice. When the bell rang, they walked together toward the main building. The stairwell smelled faintly of polish and old wood. On the landing, Martin joined them with a nod. The corridor outside the lecture room was already crowded. Professor Harrow stood by the door, his face composed, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at Hannah once and then away, as if searching for a point on the far wall. The headmaster appeared and raised a hand. "Inside, please. Let us settle." The lecture room had high windows and a worn oak podium that had served generations of speakers before this day. Rows of chairs filled quickly. Teachers lined the back wall. A few parents were already seated near the front, their winter coats folded neatly over their laps. Then the door opened again and Hannah's parents stepped in. They were not dressed to impress. Her mother wore a plain wool sweater the color of stone and a long, dark skirt. Her father had on a clean work shirt and the kind of boots that had known both city sidewalks and barn floors. Yet when they entered, something in the room shifted. The buzz of talk fell away as if the air itself had taken a breath. The headmaster went to meet them. "Thank you for coming," he said, then turned to the room. "We are gathered to discuss a matter that concerns the integrity of our classroom, the conduct of our faculty, and the promise we make to every student who walks through these doors. Mrs. Amelia Carter. Mr. James Carter." A low whisper moved through the students. Lydia leaned close to Hannah. "Your mother carries herself like a scholar," she murmured. "She is," Hannah said softly. The headmaster motioned to the front row. "Please sit." Professor Harrow remained near the wall, a little apart from the other teachers, staring at the empty podium. "We will begin," the headmaster said. His voice was calm, the cadence careful. "There has been a challenge in the advanced mathematics class. There has been a promise made. There has been an extraordinary response from a student. We are here to understand what happened and to decide what must follow." He looked to Harrow. "Professor." Harrow walked to the podium, his steps measured, his shoulders squared, his eyes composed. He placed both hands on the oak and looked out over the room. When he spoke, his voice was even. "I presented a problem to the class," he said. "It was constructed to test discipline more than memory. I stated that a solution within a short window would be rewarded." Miss Carter stepped forward and worked the heart of it with clarity. The room was witness. He paused. A muscle flickered once at his jaw. "I have been a teacher long enough to know that talent arrives in many disguises. I failed, in the moment, to recognize the form it took here." He lifted his eyes and for the first time let them rest on Hannah. "I made a promise," he said. "It will be kept." The room held still, as if waiting for a second sentence that did not come. The headmaster nodded, then turned to the front row. "Mrs. Carter. Mr. Carter, would you like to speak?" Amelia Carter rose. She moved unhurriedly to the podium, set her hands lightly on the worn wood, and smiled, not at the crowd, but at some memory that seemed to be standing just beside it. "Thank you," she said. "I am Hannah's mother. For a long time I taught applied mathematics at a university in Boston. A few of you may know its name. I worked on models that help us understand how fluids move and how systems stabilize under stress. That is a formal way of saying I studied how things flow and how they hold together when they are asked to do more than they were built to do." A rustle went through the teachers at the back. Several of the older students straightened. Amelia went on. "When our family moved to the farm, I learned that the same truths live in the fields. Water does not care if it runs past a chalkboard or past a fence post. It looks for a path. If you understand the path, you can guide it." That is all Hannah did. She saw a path where others saw a wall. She gestured gently toward the rows of students. "I also know classrooms. I know how quickly a room can decide who belongs and who does not. I have seen bright minds dim themselves to match the shape the room expects. We will not be doing that here." She stepped back. "Thank you." The headmaster inclined his head. "Mr. Carter." James Carter came to the podium with the calm of a man who had spent years standing inside the deep noise of machines. He spoke in a voice built for steady instructions over a factory floor or a flight line. "I am an engineer," he said. "I have led teams that built systems used in places where failure is not a theory. You run the numbers, you test, you look for the stress point. You do not talk louder when a joint fails. You fix the joint." He glanced toward Harrow. "We teach by example. The first example is always the word you keep." He turned back to the students. I have also repaired gates in a storm at 2 in the morning while the cattle were watching, he added, and a few quiet laughs rippled through the room. The principle is the same. He stepped away from the podium and returned to his seat. Hannah did not know she had been holding her breath until she felt it leave her. It was not pride that filled her chest, but relief, the kind that comes when what you know privately is finally spoken aloud. The headmaster lifted a folder from the table beside him. In this matter, he said, there are 2 simple questions. Was a promise made? Was it met? We have witness accounts. We have a recording from a student's phone, shared to a forum that we have archived. The answers are yes, and yes. He closed the folder. The promise will be honored. The details will be handled by the board and by me. That is the smallest part of what we must address. He let that settle, then said, we are a school. We are not a club. We are not a place where money buys a louder voice or a softer standard. We are a place where work and patience and clarity have weight. That weight belongs to anyone who can lift it. Silence again, the good kind. The kind Hannah now recognized by how it eased the space behind her ribs. A hand lifted from the 4th row. It was Martin. The headmaster nodded to him. Sir, Martin said, there is something else. He glanced just once toward Harrow, then back to the headmaster. Many of us have heard remarks in class that make a field smaller before any seed is planted. He swallowed. About where people come from. About the kind of work their parents do. The headmaster listened without interruption. Thank you, Martin. Another hand rose, then another. Lydia spoke, her voice clear. I have seen grades made a little harder to reach for students who do not fit a shape. I thought it was only me. It was not. A first year at the end of the row said quietly that he had stopped asking questions because he did not like what came back after he asked. A girl near the aisle told of an extra credit problem that had been offered and then withdrawn. The words were calm, unheeded, but they added up. Hannah kept her eyes on the podium. She did not want to watch Harrow's face, not out of spite or triumph or pity. She thought of fences and of joints and of storms. She thought of what her father had said about fixing the right part. The headmaster raised his hand. Thank you. This is not a trial. It is a school. We will treat it as such. We will listen to accounts in full and in order. We will examine grading patterns and classroom recordings where they exist. We will speak with faculty and with students privately, and then together. We will make a decision that is not hurried but is firm. He turned to Harrow. Professor, you will meet with me and with the board at day's end. Harrow's answer was a single, controlled nod. Now, the headmaster said, there is one more thing, and he looked at Hannah. Miss Carter, would you be willing to speak? Not about the equation, about what it means to work from where you are. Hannah stood. The room tilted for a moment, as if the floor had softened, and then it steadied. She walked to the podium and rested her hands on the wood where her mother's had been. I grew up where winter can empty a road and summer can fill a sky, she said. On the farm, we learned that weather does not ask who you are before it arrives. You prepare, you work, you rest when you can. You try again when you must. She looked at the students, at the familiar faces and the strangers both. When I came here, I wore the boots I had. I still do. I wrote the way my mother taught me to write, and I checked my steps the way my father taught me to check a brace before a storm. If that looked out of place, I could not help that. But the work itself did not mind. It welcomed me as it would welcome any of you. She felt the pouch of corn seeds against her palm inside her pocket. On our farm there is an old field at the edge of the property, she said. When my grandfather was a boy, people said nothing would grow there. Too much clay, not enough rain. He carried buckets by hand for a single season, one row at a time, and the field surrendered. It took longer than he thought and shorter than it could have, because he did not argue with the field. He listened. He worked. Her voice did not lift. It did not need to. I do not want a larger share of anything that belongs to everyone. I only want the gate left open so that whoever is ready to carry water may begin. If I have earned a thing, I will carry it. If I have not, I will learn how. She let her hands fall to her sides and stepped away from the podium. As she returned to her seat, the room was very quiet. In that quiet lived the soft scrape of a chair being carefully straightened, the small breath of a teacher who had been holding his lungs too still, the almost inaudible creak of old wood, appreciating well-chosen words. The headmaster spoke last. "Thank you, Miss Carter. We will follow our process. You will hear from us soon about what comes next." He dismissed the room. Outside in the corridor, voices rose again but changed shape. They were less about spectacle now and more about decisions. Lydia reached for Hannah's hand and squeezed it once. Martin nodded to her parents with a respect that needed no extra words. Harrow emerged from the lecture room after most had gone. He stepped toward Hannah's parents. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Mr. Carter." Amelia looked at him with a steady, untroubled gaze. "Professor." "I did not know who you were," he said. "You knew who my daughter was," Amelia replied. That would have been enough. He took that in without defense. Then to James he said, "Your comment about joints was apt." James nodded. "They fail where they were not tested." Harrow inclined his head. He looked then at Hannah. "You worked cleanly," he said. "It is a habit that will carry you farther than talent alone." "Thank you," Hannah said. She meant it. He stepped back. "I will meet with the headmaster," he said quietly, and left it there. In the late afternoon, the winter sun rode low and gold across the school's stone walls. Hannah walked with her parents out under the bare maples. The air smelled of thawed earth and cold iron. They did not speak for a while. There was a peace in the simple sound of their steps together. At the gate, James touched the top rail with the palm of his hand, a gesture he made at every threshold he respected. "Your mother and I will come home with you," he said. "We will make soup." Amelia smiled. "And afterward we will sit with the notebooks if you like." "I would," Hannah said. They rode the bus back to the edge of the city where their small apartment waited with its lamps and its steady table. The evening settled like a shawl around the building. The soup simmered. Steam clouded the kitchen window and cleared again, clouded and cleared, like breath on a cold day. After the dishes were washed and dried, Hannah laid out her papers. Amelia drew a simple system on a blank sheet, nothing more than a set of lines and arrows that described how a quantity changed over time. She pushed the paper toward Hannah. "Tell me what this wants." "It wants balance," Hannah said. "And it wants patience." "Show me," Amelia said. Hannah wrote, and as she did, she talked her way through the choices. James listened from his chair by the window, adding a word only when it would lay like a solid plank where two pieces of thought met. When they were done, Hannah tucked the notebook away and reached for the pouch in her pocket. She poured a few corn seeds into her palm. They shone dull gold in the light of the lamp. "I will plant these," she said, "when the ground is ready." "You already are," Amelia said. James leaned his head against the window frame. The city lights were a scatter of small fires in the night. "Tomorrow," he said, "they will begin to ask questions they should have asked long ago. Let them. The answers are already in the work." Hannah closed her fingers gently around the seeds. She did not know the outcome of the meetings the headmaster had promised. She did not know how far the echo of this day would travel down the halls or into the offices with their framed certificates and quiet carpets. She only knew the feel of the kernels against her skin and the sound of her parents moving about the room and the clean tiredness that comes after a field well walked. When she lay down to sleep, the city hummed at its usual pitch. Somewhere far away a train spoke once into the dark. In her mind, a board held clean lines, a classroom held a good silence, and a promise stood where it had been placed. She would return to it, as one returns to a row in the early light, ready to pull the next length of earth into a straight, honest furrow. Morning would come. Work would be waiting, and she would meet it. By the following Monday, the investigation was no longer whispered about in corners. It had settled into the bones of St. Alden Academy. Students walked past Harrow with sidelong glances. Teachers paused in mid-sentence when he entered a room. The air carried a quiet expectation, as though everyone was waiting for a door to open and something long hidden to step out. Hannah kept to her routine. She took notes. She helped Lydia and Martin in the library. She carried the pouch of corn seeds in her coat pocket, its small weight a reminder that work was done one row at a time. Late that afternoon, the headmaster's secretary appeared at the door of the advanced mathematics classroom. "The board requests Miss Carter and her parents," she said. The students looked up from their books. Harrow's chalk paused in mid-stroke. The meeting was held in a paneled room the students rarely entered. Heavy curtains softened the winter light. Along one wall sat the school's board members, a mix of long-tenured educators and alumni whose portraits hung in the hallway. Hannah sat between her mother and father. Harrow occupied a chair to their left, his posture formal, his face composed but drawn. The headmaster began. "We have spoken to students, to staff, and to Professor Harrow. We have reviewed records. What has come forward is not only about a promise, but a pattern." One of the board members leaned forward. "Professor Harrow, witnesses have described comments and actions that singled out students based on background, appearance, or presumed ability. Do you dispute this?" Harrow's voice was quiet. "I acknowledge that I have at times allowed assumptions to guide my words." The headmaster nodded gravely. "Miss Carter, there is something you should know. During our review, we learned that your mother was once on the faculty at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and your father led engineering work for aerospace contracts. These are not details you offered." "I did not think they were the point," Hannah said. Amelia Carter looked at the board. "We left those positions for reasons of our own. The value of a student's mind should not rest on a resume, hers or ours." James Carter added, "A name on a letterhead is not a measure of what someone can do. The field is still the field. The work is still the work." The board listened. Then the headmaster turned to Harrow. "Were you aware of this background before you made your remarks to Miss Carter?" "No," Harrow said. "Would it have changed your approach if you had known?" Harrow hesitated. "It should not have, but it might have, and that is the fault I have to face." There was a long quiet. The headmaster spoke again. "The board has voted to end Professor Harrow's tenure at St. Alden Academy. In addition, the $100,000 from the challenge will be placed into a new fund, the Hannah Carter Opportunity Fund, to support students of potential who have been underestimated." Hannah turned to her parents, but they were already looking at her, not with surprise, but with the calm of people who had known the ground would turn this way. Harrow rose. "I will contribute to the fund beyond that amount," he said. "I will also ask for the chance to return, someday, when I have rebuilt the way I think about my work." Amelia inclined her head. That would be a better promise than the last one. Outside the boardroom, the corridor was nearly empty. The winter light through the high windows painted long rectangles on the floor. Lydia and Martin were waiting at the far end. "Well," Martin said, "you changed more than the answer on a blackboard." Lydia smiled. "And you kept the gate open." Hannah touched the pouch in her pocket. There would be more rows to walk, more knots to untie, but the first harvest was already in sight. The notice went out before sunrise. By the time Hannah reached St. Alden Academy, the news had already circled the campus twice. A brief message from the headmaster's office stated that Professor Leonard Harrow's tenure had ended effective immediately. The letter did not detail the board's decision, but students and faculty had their own versions, whispered between classes or over coffee in the staff lounge. In the advanced mathematics classroom, Harrow's desk stood empty. A substitute teacher handed out problem sets without comment. The usual morning hum felt thinner, as if the room itself noticed the absence. At lunch, Lydia found Hannah in their usual spot by the tall window. "Did you see it?" she asked. Hannah nodded. Martin joined them, setting his tray down with more force than necessary. "They will replace him," he said. "But the fund is real." The fund, the Hannah Carter Opportunity Fund, was now more than a line in a board resolution. The headmaster had asked Hannah to help shape its purpose. She had spent the weekend thinking, sitting at the kitchen table with her parents, listening to their stories of students they had taught and engineers they had mentored. That afternoon, she was called to the headmaster's office. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper. On his desk lay a blank ledger, its cover dark and plain. "This is yours to begin," he said. "The board has placed the first deposit, $100,000. Mr. Harrow has added 25,000 more. It will grow from here." Hannah ran her hand over the cover. "What do you want it to do?" she asked. "I want it to do what you have done in this school," the headmaster replied. "To look past first impressions, to invest in those who might be overlooked." Hannah thought of the boy in the first-year class who had stopped asking questions, of Lydia before they had spoken, of Martin's surprise at learning there were other ways to start a problem. "We should choose not just by grades," she said, "but by how someone works, by what they give to others in the room." The headmaster smiled faintly. "Then write it down." Over the next week, Hannah met with students who had ideas for the fund. Lydia suggested a small library of specialized textbooks for anyone to borrow. Martin proposed a mentorship program pairing younger students with older ones willing to share their methods. Others wanted workshops in the summer, open to those from outside the school. Hannah listened, took notes, and kept the ledger open on her desk at home. Her mother reminded her that a good field plan starts with knowing the lay of the land. Her father told her that the best structures are the ones you can add to over time without tearing out the frame. By Friday, she had a plan. The fund would award resources, not just money, access to materials, guidance, and space to work. Applicants would write not about what they had achieved, but about what they wanted to learn and how they would share it. Decisions would be made by a small committee of students and teachers together. When she presented it to the headmaster, he read it in silence, then closed the ledger. "This will stand," he said. News of the plan spread quickly. Students stopped her in the halls to ask when applications would open. Teachers offered to lead sessions. Someone tacked a hand-lettered sign on the library door. "Opportunity Fund. Coming soon." One evening, on her way home, Hannah passed the school gates just as Harrow stepped out of a waiting car. He carried no briefcase. His coat collar was turned up against the wind. "Miss Carter," he said, stopping a pace away. "Professor," Hannah said, "I have read what you are building. It is better than I could have done." "It is not finished," Hannah replied. "Good," he said. "Leave it unfinished. That way it can keep growing." He hesitated, then added, "I will send more when I can." Hannah nodded. "Thank you." He turned and walked away, his steps measured on the frosted pavement. At home, Hannah wrote the day's notes in the ledger. She paused, touched the pouch of corn seeds in her pocket, and smiled. The fund was like a field in early spring, bare to the eye, but already seeded with more than one harvest. 6 months later, the courtyard of St. Alden Academy no longer looked like the same place Hannah had first crossed in her scuffed boots. Long tables stood under white canvas awnings. Displays lined the walkways, not the usual polished science fair boards, but living demonstrations. A first-year student showed a working model of a windmill built from salvaged wood. 2 second years explained their translation project that turned dense biology articles into plain language for rural clinics. In one corner, Lydia stood beside a table covered in open textbooks and laptops, the seed of the library she had envisioned. It was the first day of many minds, funded and organized by the Hannah Carter Opportunity Fund. Hannah arrived early, her hands in the pockets of her plain blue dress. The pouch of corn seeds was there, as it had been every day. She walked the courtyard slowly, greeting each student, asking about their work. She saw the pride in their faces, not pride in winning, but in showing what they had built and learned. The headmaster opened the day with a few quiet words. "This is not a contest," he told the gathered crowd. "This is an open gate. Walk through it, and you may find yourself standing in a field you did not know you could tend." As the morning passed, visitors from the community arrived. Parents, former students, even local shopkeepers who had read about the fund in the newspaper. The courtyard hummed with conversation, ideas passing between people who might never have met otherwise. In the early afternoon, as Hannah was helping Martin adjust the wiring on his demonstration, a familiar voice came from behind her. "Miss Carter." She turned. Leonard Harrow stood there, wearing a simple gray coat. He looked thinner, the sharpness in his expression softened. In his hands was an envelope. "For the fund," he said. "A new contribution." Hannah took it, feeling the weight of it, not just in paper and currency, but in what it meant. "Thank you," she said. "I have been teaching again," Harrow added. "Not here, but at a night program. Different students, different lives. I have had to learn more in the past months than I did in years before." She nodded. "Learning is heavier when you carry it yourself." He almost smiled. "You taught me that." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the courtyard around them, a burst of laughter from Lydia's table, the soft clink of tools, the murmur of an explanation being given with care. Hannah extended her hand. Harrow took it. "Keep learning," she said, "the way I did." He released her hand with a nod and stepped back into the crowd, speaking quietly to a group of younger students who looked at him with open curiosity. Late in the afternoon, the courtyard grew golden in the lowering sun. The headmaster invited Hannah to the small stage set against the school's stone wall. She looked out at the faces, friends, strangers, teachers, parents. "This day is not about me," she began. "It is about what happens when we see one another clearly, when we choose to make room instead of closing the gate. The work you see here was done by many hands, each with its own way of shaping the earth." She touched the pouch in her pocket. "My grandfather planted a field everyone said would never grow. He did it one row at a time. This fund is the same. One idea, one chance, one person who is given room to work." She stepped down, and the day went on until the first stars showed. That night, at home, Hannah poured the corn seeds into her palm. She set aside 3 for planting in a small pot on the windowsill. The rest went back into the pouch. There were more seasons ahead. In the quiet, she thought of the courtyard filled with voices, of the open hands that had built the day. The field was not only hers now, it belonged to all who had walked through the gate. And somewhere, in classrooms and barns and libraries yet unseen, the next row was already waiting to be planted. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story of Hannah Carter, the farm girl from a small patch of Kansas who carried her intelligence and patience into the halls of a prestigious academy, leaving her mark not only through solutions written in chalk, but by opening the gate of opportunity for others. I hope that in these pages you have felt the warmth of a kitchen fire, the steadiness of working hands, and the belief that intellect knows no boundary of birth or background. This story is offered to all who have been underestimated, who have walked in silence, and who have kept planting seeds in their own field. Thank you, and may you always keep a sky of your own, a field of your own, in which to sow the seeds of knowledge and kindness.